Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's forum, Cooperative Resilience, Evidence and Action. I'm Jesse Garikan, OCDC consultant based in Kigali, Rwanda. Please let us know in the poll where you are joining us from and the institution you represent. We look forward to receiving your questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A box. It is my great honor to lead this engaging and interactive webinar today, which focuses on the central question of resilience in moments of shock. We focus our program today on cooperative enterprises, which are democratic businesses helping members to better their economic and social well-being while contributing to national and regional development. In Africa, cooperatives move the needle forward on the decent work agenda by facilitating dignified economic opportunities for millions. The positive economic and social impact of cooperatives was proven across sectors and geographies by OCDC. What difference do cooperatives make? Global study. I hope that you have completed the poll. Let us see the results. Today's program, we will begin by describing the main phases of cooperative resilience. In part one of the program, we will examine the evidence from the ICRG resilience program. In part two, launching into action, we will explore practical tools to increase cooperative resilience into the future. In part three, we will hear global voices and perspectives in Resilience Roundtable, donor reflections, and regional insights. If you are ready, let us dive right in. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Judith Hammerson, Director of the International Cooperative Research Group, for the opening remarks. Dr. Hammerson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be with everybody today. And I extend to you all a very, very warm welcome on behalf of the entire OCDC team. We're so glad that you could be with us today as we discuss the important topic of cooperative resilience. And as Mr. Galakan was sharing with you, we have designed the agenda to include voices and expertise of our partners, fellow researchers, OCDC CDO members, cooperative members, and members of the International Cooperative Research Group, ICRG for short, as also Mr. Galakan indicated. It's a mouthful, but I will use that. ICRG, as many of you may know, is the research arm of OCDC, and we conduct independent, rigorous research that engages with local stakeholders, prioritizes knowledge that produces practical policy and operational solutions. So I would like now to take a few minutes at the beginning to tell you a bit about this cooperative resilience initiative that's brought us together today. It's taken many different approaches and has been collaborative, rooted in realities as experienced by cooperatives. Undertaken with our partners and colleagues, the research is also grounded in the recognition that cooperative resilience has many different aspects. Sorry, there are no silver bullets here. But to begin to capture the many faces of cooperative resilience, we've approached it from a variety of perspectives. The work on cooperative resilience will continue, and no doubt, and that what we have done here is only a part of an emerging picture. Nonetheless, we are proud that the work we will discuss today has a vital role to play in clarifying, understanding, and providing actionable evidence. We hope that you will come away from this forum with greater knowledge and insight into patterns from the evidence that show greater or lesser resilience for cooperatives, greater knowledge about specific aspects of the challenges posed, and general and specific lessons that can be adapted and applied. And we will have shared on the registrations website, we have done that, some resources that are the outcomes of this research that we hope you will find valuable. They include a practical guide to green finance for cooperatives wanting to access funding and finance, a synthesis from the research results from the collaborative research initiatives, and an annotated bibliography detailing relevant sources from the literature. Could I have the next slide, please? So, to get to the basics, what do we mean by resilience? In this pandemic and post-pandemic world, the word resilience is tossed around quite liberally. In the greater cooperative community, we have heard the assertion that cooperatives are resilient due to their business model and their concern for community. Today and throughout our research, we define resilience as the ability to withstand external shock, but not just to withstand, to thrive and to flourish. If you could click through, Luann, please. We will explore with you today what resilience has meant in reality. Back to the last slide, please. Have cooperatives come under more pressure to respond to new needs of members and the larger community, such as food, transport, health-related equipment? How have economic performance and members' livelihoods been impacted? How have cooperatives fared at the market? What challenges have emerged? And how have cooperatives managed some of the resulting tensions that might have emerged between social and economic priorities of their members? And learning from these, how should we look forward to the future? How can cooperatives adapt and respond to the rapidly evolving landscape in which they find themselves? To answer these and other questions, we've explored cooperative resilience within the broad framework, as you see here, of agility and flexibility and adaptability, including their connection to members, the connection to community, and the values-based business model. And we are trying to, from these, learn forward-looking strategies or derive forward-looking strategies. We've sought to understand cooperative resilience rigorously and systematically from the experiences of co-op members, from macro data, and from quantitative and qualitative data collected through in-person surveys and focus groups. And you're going to be hearing more about this as we go forward. Each research product of the 15 cooperative resilience focused activities that we're drawing on today stands on its own. At the same time, and this is why we're excited to be here today with you, taken together, the research outcomes provide some broadly applicable lessons and insights, and they have informed the development of the tools that I have just mentioned. As you will hear from our presentations, cooperative resilience is greatly strengthened by its values-based business model, adhering to cooperative principles. At the same time, as you will also hear, tension among these may arise sometimes and hard choices made. Next slide, please. The exploration of cooperative resilience is broader than COVID-19, or even as it probes how cooperatives have coped when the pandemic has hit. External shocks have many faces and their impacts many different facets. And these range, and we all know this, but from drought and flooding due to climate change, restricted mobility and health challenges due to pandemic, business viability impacting cooperatives and their members' livelihoods across sectors, and the normal functioning of cooperatives, challenging social capital, the ability to respond and plan, and many other ways, some of which we will explore. How have cooperative change fared, for example, when climate change conspired with the pandemic to cause even greater disruption? How well have their internal processes and procedures served them? How were they helped or impeded by the market and government policies during the crisis? Next slide, please. It's a complex subject indeed. So you will hear both about very specific challenges and situations. For example, in a specific value chain, there may be a specific issue that was encountered and the lessons learned from that. You will also hear about the broader implications of the lessons. And from all of this, we'll share with you some of the ways, as I mentioned, that we are developing tools and new resources, and some of these are in progress as well as the ones completed. What all of these varied activities share is their academic rigor, their local engagement, and their intention to develop evidence and knowledge that has practical application and will contribute to an even more resilient cooperative sector. Next slide, please. One thing that we do believe is certain, based on the evidence that we all can understand, external shocks will continue to disrupt communities, markets, and economies. So we also believe that the time is right, the time is now, for cooperatives to strengthen their resilience and be as prepared as possible. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope that you will contribute your own perspectives and knowledge to the dialogue on cooperative resilience today and in the days and months ahead. Thank you again.
Thank you too. Wow, it's amazing. We thank you so much for the amazing presentation, Dr. Juice Hammerson, the presentation of how cooperatives have coped with external shocks. Our next speaker is our CDC senior researcher who will present from crisis to resilience, how cooperatives responded to the COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Megan Fitzgerald. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chessa, and welcome to everyone. I'm very happy to be here talking about this with you all today. It's a very important topic. So I'll now discuss the study that we completed this year regarding COVID-19, cooperatives, and resilience. Through this research, we sought to identify the major challenges faced by cooperatives in sub-Saharan Africa during COVID-19, as well as strategies and strengths employed by cooperatives to mitigate adversity. Further, we endeavored to understand whether and how these challenges and strengths related to cooperative business resilience. Next slide, please. So we sampled 30 cooperatives representing mainly the agricultural sector with various value chains, as well as a few housing cooperatives. These cooperatives were sampled from a larger group that had participated in the CLE and CLLE events that were held from 2016 to 2018, and for whom we had data that we had collected from this time. So through a combination of survey interviews and focus groups with these same cooperatives, collected current data and were able to make comparisons between 2021 data and pre-COVID-19 across multiple factors that were related to cooperative operations, policies, and environments. So from these findings, we were able to make interpretations about the impacts of COVID-19 and cooperative resilience. In these next few slides, I will share with you a higher level main highlights of our study. Next slide, please. So we measured business resilience using the business membership ratio, which is the cooperative's annual income divided by number of members. The business resilient cooperatives were those who saw a positive change in BMR from pre-COVID-19 to 2021. The non-business resilient cooperatives were those who saw a decline in BMR. So our results showed that about half of the sampled cooperatives were in fact business resilient and half were not. So naturally, this led us to ask why, what were the challenges that faced cooperatives, and why were some able to thrive even during a pandemic while others were not. Next slide, please. So from pre-COVID-19 to 2021, membership increased for all cooperatives in the sample. One major difference between the business resilient cooperatives and the non-business resilient was the degree to which membership increased. As you can see from this graph, the non-business resilient cooperatives membership increased nearly threefold compared to the business resilient membership. Further, the non-business resilient cooperatives average annual income decreased while business resilient cooperatives income increased. A substantial increase in membership alongside a declining income may have placed an untenable strain on resources for those non-business resilient cooperatives. However, it is interesting to note that all cooperatives in this study saw an uptake in membership from before COVID-19 to 2021. And this indicates that cooperatives were seen as a desirable option, providing much needed services during widespread hardship. Next slide, please. So cooperatives reported a few different challenges. Actually, they reported a lot of challenges, but some of the main ones I'll discuss with you now. So government restrictions that were imposed on mobility during COVID-19 was reported as the greatest challenge across all cooperatives, significantly impacting when, where, and how these members could meet, as well as the transportation of members and products. Non-business resilient cooperatives had a greater average distance to the nearest city, being almost twice as far away as the business resilient cooperatives. A greater distance raises the cost of transporting goods for members and cooperatives alike, and may have been exacerbated by increases in the cost of transportation during those government-imposed restrictions. Other major difficulties included financial hardships, such as job loss, inability to pay rent, and defaulting on loans, as well as reduced operations and sales, which would be a byproduct of both mobility and financial challenges. Next slide, please. However, on a positive note, all the cooperatives in this study were able to remain open during COVID-19, which speaks to the sustainability and adaptability of the cooperative model. The ability to innovate new ways of operating through changes that were made in operations, policies, trainings, and the adoption of new technology were reported as major strengths for cooperatives and provided flexibility in the face of external shock. For example, some dairy cooperatives began making yogurt, cheese, and powdered milk with the surplus milk that could not be sold due to curfews and transportation issues, instead of letting it go to waste and taking a loss. Other cooperatives relied heavily on diversifying their products and found that it helped to maintain their revenue. For example, a housing cooperative created income-generating projects that could bring in revenue apart from savings. They now run posho mill machines, a welding workshop, and a car wash. In Malawi, an agricultural cooperative diversified their activities from growing only tobacco to growing other crops like soybeans in response to local and neighboring countries' demand. Additionally, the commitment and trust of members was cited as a significant strength. Some leaders spoke in the focus groups about their members choosing not to side sell, even when they were offered higher prices for their product. They remain loyal to their cooperative. Next slide, please. So this slide shows two quotes from some of the CLE leaders that participated in the focus groups regarding the commitment of members. And I'll just go ahead and read those quickly. So from a non-business resilient cooperative leader, they had to say that the major strength we've had is cooperation among members. Though there are many challenges, they all came together. And even when they were faced with high prices from the uptakers, the degree of cooperation was high. Members came together and shared how to work together. Because of this, we got high volumes. And then a business resilient cooperative leader said that the main strength was just based on trust from members and trust from other areas. Next slide, please. So furthermore, Another positive is that all cooperatives in this sample provided some kind of service to their members related to COVID-19. These included PPE, such as masks, hand washing stations, sanitizer, as well as health trainings, housing, and food. Surprisingly, a greater proportion of the non-business resilient cooperatives provided each service compared to the business resilient cooperatives. Non-business resilient cooperatives also saw a greater increase in membership, possibly increasing the demand for services. It is unknown whether the provision of more services may have contributed to a decrease in BMR during COVID-19 for these cooperatives. But this example shows another achievement of cooperatives in the face of hardship, the ability to serve their members in times of need despite external shocks. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a word cloud that shows the responses of participants in the study to the question, what was your greatest strength during COVID-19? And I just love it. I think it's so interesting and encompasses all the values of cooperatives right there. So in conclusion, we found that business performance was just one measure of cooperative resilience, which does not encompass the entire spectrum of factors that help sustain a cooperative. Even those cooperatives whose business performance declined during COVID-19 managed to stay in operation. Not only did they remain open, but they were able to offer important services to their members during a time of great difficulty. These achievements are testaments to the fortitude and value of the cooperative model during times of widespread external hardship. The fact that those who experienced declines in business performance were those who offered the most services is an interesting point of inquiry in regards to the balance between service provision and business viability for cooperatives that may be explored in future research. Thank you very much. That concludes my presentation, and I'll hand it back to you, Chessa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fitzgerald. I believe the findings will inform for future policies and strategies. So our next presenter will be focusing on the Collaborative Research for Cooperatives Resilience Program. Our CDC Research Manager and our CDC Communication Manager will take on this topic. Please welcome Ms. Ria Lucas and Ms. Celine Brown. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Celine Brown, the OCDC ICRG Communications Manager, and I'm happy to be joined by Leah Marie Lucas, the OCDC ICRG Research Manager, for the session Diving Deeper into the Data Collaborative Research Results. Thank you, Leah, for being here.
Thank you, Slandy. It's a pleasure.
So we have a lot to discuss, so we are going to go ahead and dive right into the conversation. So first, Leah, do you mind sharing a little bit about what the CR2 research, was and what were the main objectives?
Yes, I'm happy to. So the CR2 research is standing for Collaborative Research for Cooperative Resilience. And this was a research portfolio designed to be collaborative in nature, like its name. The program intended to explore resilience of cooperatives through diverse value chains and sectors in emerging markets. Additionally, the program sought to carry out research that is aligned with the ICRG research approach, research agenda for the year, and that could be simultaneously beneficial to a partner organization. So through this opportunity, we offered partner institutions the opportunity to really put our heads together to co-create the research design, the methodology, and to ultimately come together with a co-created research concept. And so these were the main objectives going into the CR2 research. We were really excited by the interest of partners in applying to this opportunity and to the projects that we ultimately funded through this mechanism.
That's amazing. So could you talk a little bit more about what those specific CR2 projects were? What were some of the things that they focused on?
Yes, so thinking about the CR2 projects, They're all focused on resilience. And so they intersect in some way with the ability of cooperative enterprises to adapt to and operate in moments of crisis. And so, of course, this research program was inspired by the COVID-19 economic and health crisis, and really emerged during that era when we were beginning to grapple with the impacts of the COVID-19 shock. That being said, the program was not focused solely on COVID-19 related impacts. Of course, we acknowledge that COVID-19 impacted every one of our projects, but specifically 2 of the 6 projects covered the impact of the COVID-19 shock in diverse sectors. And so those projects were focusing on agricultural value chains, looking at the dairy sector in Rwanda and Kenya. And we're also looking at SACCOs in Kenya, looking at horticulture in addition to 2 other industries. There are 4 other projects, a part of the same portfolio, which were of course impacted by COVID-19, but did not focus solely on COVID-19 as the research inquiry. And so these projects looked instead at the phenomenon of climate change, with one project detailing climate smart agricultural policies and their adoption across East African countries. Additionally, we had projects that investigated issues related to the demographic dividend and operational and environmental challenges. And so while these projects that focused more on operational and environmental policy challenges perhaps did not directly respond to the COVID-19 crisis at the time, we do believe that during moments of crisis, it's very important to not only take short-term actions, but also medium to long-term actions that can have a big impact on increasing the resilience in a sustainable way to the future.
That's great. Like what you mentioned, it's amazing to be able to hear about and learn about how diverse those groups of projects were, and how, like what you mentioned, they're all connecting back to that central theme of resilience. So taking a look at that and diving a little bit deeper into the data and some of the findings of this research, could you take a bit of a look now into a sectoral lens? So with that central goal and objective of increasing resilience, how can we do that, say, in the agricultural sector?
So this is a huge question, and one that the answer will really vary based on the value chain, the region of production, agroecological conditions, and also regional risk factors to successful agricultural production. So I will take 2 scenarios from our research portfolio and answer this question in light of the results that we gained. The first scenario is regarding adaptation to climate change. And so in this project, we partnered with ICA Africa, and we looked at coffee cooperatives and coffee production through the cooperative model across East Africa. And as our audience is likely well aware, East Africa is a very important region for global coffee production. And it is a region that is already being impacted by the climate crisis in terms of yields and suitable production areas, which are going to be changing, in addition to the time aspect of when crops are ready for harvesting. And so taking proactive steps is necessary in order for these farmers to be able to be more resilient to the already changing climate in their regions. And these farmers are really dependent on the coffee crop for their livelihoods. And so what we found in this research project is that while at the macro level and at the level of the national government, there were quite positive policies to promoting and prioritizing climate smart agriculture in coffee. However, at the cooperative or at the farmer level, it was not always so easy to see that these policies were really being put into place. And so one of the key findings is regarding the implementation of change and new technology that we need to implement to enhance resilience. And so in this case, we found that sometimes the youth members of the cooperative, women members of the cooperative demonstrated a bit more openness to changing their practices and a bit more eagerness in terms of using new technologies. And so a way that we could enhance resilience is by enhancing the diversity of cooperatives, including opportunities for more youth and for women to have more decision-making power in these cooperatives. Additionally, farmers are not going to change their practices without seeing a real market incentive to do so. And so we need to consider market incentives that can proactively encourage farmers to make the necessary changes before time runs out. I will briefly explain from a second project that really highlighted value chains in East Africa. In this case, we partnered with Venture 37, Land O'Lakes, and GenX, and we looked at dairy in Rwanda and Kenya. And in this case, both countries, Rwanda and Kenya, had significant lockdowns during the period of COVID-19. These COVID-19 lockdowns impacted how farmers and input suppliers and all of those service provision members could really get to the farm, could provide the services that they provide for the betterment of the livestock and of the dairy sector. And so during this period of time, services such as artificial insemination were significantly limited, and farmers were even divesting out of livestock production because of the changes in the market and because of their profitability, which was decreasing. And so such challenges, such stagnation over a period of time, even if the lockdowns have now been lifted, these challenges do not just go away by themselves. And so the key finding here for jumpstarting resilience in a sector like dairy would be to really investigate the impact that such limited access to artificial insemination could have had on the overall genetic quality of the stock, and really critical investments to jumpstart these industries so that a short-term shock does not become a medium to long-term challenge for the industries. So two very diverse examples, but I preferred to give you that kind of micro-level answer because it is such a large question, and a detailed and data-driven answer really needs to be taken into account. So thank you, Slandy.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you, Leah. I like what you said, that micro level perspective. I think that's so important. And I know we could probably talk for ages about that even further with the level of detail and the rigor that went a part of these research studies. And so one thing that you mentioned that was really interesting also was that macro level perspective as well. So if we take a look at that and look at the macro environment, what are some things that cooperatives need to specifically leverage in policy environments in order to flourish?
This is a great question. And when we think about the macro environment or the enabling environment, we think about all of these conditions that surround a cooperative enterprise. And so we think about policies, we think about laws, we think about regulations, other players, the government, and all of the different partners and players that are really in the ecosystem of the cooperative. And so rather than focusing on the macro level of the enabling environment, in this research, we actually found that the micro level, and that is the policy environments that are intra-cooperative, so the policies that cooperatives make for themselves, actually have a very important role in enhancing their resilience during times of shock. And so we've gone, you asked me to go macro, but I'm going to take it back to the cooperative, because as you know, a cooperative is defined as an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. And so this is the statement on cooperative identity from ICA. And so it is a democratically controlled enterprise. It is the cooperative members themselves that have a say in the governance of the cooperative. And so some of the challenges that we found through the CR2 research portfolio was that cooperatives did not necessarily have the agility and the flexibility in their decision-making processes to quickly transition and change how they were being governed and how they could make decisions. And so the cooperatives in our portfolio that did have greater flexibility and, for example, immediately allowed for online general assemblies and online decision-making platforms to take place were able to continue with business, perhaps not as usual, but more normally than those cooperatives that were only able to meet in person. And during periods of lockdown, then meant that they couldn't meet and make decisions together, decisions that could have been critical to allowing them to take necessary action at a critical time to change their business practices in light of the COVID-19 challenges and the shifting market dynamics. And so while the macro level policy environment is very important, and we did some important work as well in this area with our partner NCBA CLUSA, looking at the Clarity tool, I wanted to highlight this cooperative level answer, because sometimes we think that the solution is outside of the cooperative, when in fact there are so many actions, and even my colleague Dr. Czachorska Jones will explain in a session to come a resilience tool that the ICRG has developed, which is essentially seeking to do just this, seeking to help the cooperatives build internal policies and structures that can enhance the resilience in times of shocks.
Oh, I love that. I love what you said about it. It really goes back to the cooperative. And one thing that I always love to encourage and talk about with people is how we can be cooperatives, not only by name, but by action. And I think that, the insights that you just shared will help us accomplish just that. So I know we're short on time, but Leah, if we want to learn more, if we want to be able to read the research report, could you tell us how we could do that and continue this conversation even after this session today?
Definitely. We look forward to your reactions, to your questions, to your comments. We'll have time today for just a few, I'm sure, during the dialogue, but you can find the research report on our website, www.ocdc.coop, and take a look there. Reach out to us with any questions, and we look forward to the continuation of this dialogue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you, Slandy.
Thank you, everyone.
Wow, thank you so much, Ms. Ria and Ms. Landy, for the good, engaging dialogue. So you help us to understand much more about the collaborative and resilience with our cooperatives. Really, you made a great job. So for the sake of time, we support to welcome some few questions and get answers. But as you send the questions in writing, you are also getting our answers in writing. So we make sure that the answers to your question is coming, and we are continuing with our presentation. Thank you so much for the presentation, and you allow us to be a flying wall during your engaging dialogue on the implication of the CR2 research finding. It's really amazing work. Our next presenter, or our next session we are engaging in now, we're going to look into the practical tools and financing to increasing cooperative resilience. So if you allow me, please welcome Dr. Barbara Jones and Mr. Nicole Hang for the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to go back to what was just said by Leah a moment ago, the operations and the internal mechanisms that the cooperative has at its disposal are extremely important. And this is exactly what we wanted to zoom in this particular section of our presentation. Next slide, please. The need for better understanding what resilience really is goes back to our session at the beginning of this year, when participants identified 2 specific areas in which we really need to work some more. And the first one is what factors really impact resilience within a business model such as cooperative, business model, people-oriented. And the second one was, what are the financing options? What are the opportunities, and how can cooperatives use those opportunities best? So during our presentation, I'm going to talk about this first area. And what we did along all the different other projects that Leah was just talking about, we worked with our consultant colleagues who looked at the existing literature to identify not only what exists in terms of frameworks, in terms of factors that are important for the cooperatives to focus on, but also on operations of the cooperative itself. Next slide, please. So as was mentioned, there are a lot of studies that look at all types of businesses, and the characteristics, organizational characteristics that were identified are also relatively well known. This is agility, flexibility, responsiveness, ability to understand and take actions quickly. Well, within the context of a cooperative, this translates to both external and internal factors that very specifically impact the resiliency. And what you see here on the right-hand side is a list of factors that our consultants identified through their research and through consultancies with the collaborative group and the members of OCDC is specifically important for operations for any cooperatives. And it is at these specific areas that there are opportunities for internal actions to improve that level. Taking all of that into consideration, we have worked on developing our own resilience framework that could visualize the process and make it easier for cooperatives. And I want to invite Nicholas right now to speak a little bit about that resiliency framework.
So we started with a broad literature review and identifying frameworks which applied to businesses. And we wanted to ensure that any framework that we developed and any resulting action plans needed to consider the short to long-term impact on organizational resiliency, here labeled on the bottom as the resiliency continuum, the positive impact on increasing organizational strength, which strengthened the organization's response to shocks, as seen on the right, as well as to be mindful of any resource intensity of these actions, which you can see on the slope above the triangle. At the same time, in order to increase the motivation to action, any framework needed to be conscious of an increasing return on investment. From our annual learning event, where we discussed points of ability, agility, and curiosity, we included a resilience continuum framework used by Irwin and Campbell. And lastly, after much discussion, we wanted to create something that was not only accessible to the general population, but still captured our intentions and, of course, our academic standards, which therefore resulted in the framework that you see here. The framework takes into consideration many of the factors that we discussed earlier, actions taken on the bottom left side of the continuum are seen as short-term responses to external shocks. When you think disaster preparedness, that's the type of action. Knowing the number for your local fire department, for example, or saving documents in a waterproof safe. The medium continuity actions are geared to a return to business as normal or pre-shock level. These actions can include ensuring that a business has enough inventory to sell to their customers, or in the case of cooperatives, some cooperatives made decisions like drawing from their member savings to ensure that their supply chain was not negatively affected. Lastly, the activities on the upper right side, the highest on the triangle, here termed transformative or evolutionary, are actions that go beyond simple normalcy and considers the longest term changes that allow long-term flourishing and represents the strongest defense against future shocks. We saw real world examples of these in our research. Coffee cooperatives would set up beehives among their coffee trees, and cooperatives would utilize new apps and technologies to get the most up-to-date information and to communicate those among their cooperative members. These examples may take an increasing amount of resource intensity, whether time, budget, or labor, but also resulted in the most return on investment. Back to you, Dr. Troska-Jones.
Thank you. So what did we do with all of that information, both theoretical and partly practical from coming from the research that our colleagues were already talking about? We tried to put it together in the form of a diagnostic tool that would help the cooperative build on their internal strengths and mechanisms already existing. So the process is intended to involve the whole cooperative, not only the leaders, but leaders working together with cooperative members. And the process is a two-step in that step one allows the group to take a quick snapshot of where they are at this particular point vis-a-vis the specific factors that can positively impact their resilience. And the second step is the same type of factor considered again, but through a much more detailed lens, and actions that could possibly be taken or should be taken if they haven't, so that the cooperative in fact can move up the pyramid, the one that Nicholas was talking about. Nicholas, I would ask you now to please tell us very briefly, using the example of a criteria or the factor that we have selected, communication with members, to just walk us through the first and second step very briefly.
Thank you, Dr. Troska-Jones. If we can proceed to the next slide. So step one is the self-assessment. And so a cooperative would organize a committee of members, managers, and board members to work through the tool. And so in this case, we have communication with members, and it is up to that group to determine how they fare on our grading scale here of each item. It is also important to note that they have to provide evidence to support that assessment. And so next slide, please. Following that self-assessment, and they work through all of the different factors, the cooperative is then led through a more detailed discussion of actions that could be taken that strengthens the respective factors' level of resilience. It is one thing, for example, to discuss whether they feel that the communication in their cooperative is good. It's another thing to know how and what makes up good functioning communication and whether they actually have good communication among the members. Step two discussions are based on a simple what, why, who, when, how model, and involves developing an action plan for the cooperative to put in place that creates change that increases organizational resiliency. Following the discussion in step 2, cooperative users are given the opportunity to reassess their answers for step 1 to determine more accurately where their organization is on the resilience continuum. After completing the entire assessment, the organization implements their action plan, which consists of components that, through the research that our team has created, was seen as the most effective responses to each of these factors. The organization implements their action plan, and further down the road at a later time can reassess where they stand in the framework to see if they have followed through with their action plan and whether their scores improve. The ultimate goal is to help the cooperative move from reactive actions seen on the left side of the continuum to strategically planned growth, and then move up the pyramid in the framework. Back to you, Doctor.
Next slide, please. So how do we bridge our research and planning of our diagnostic tools with the reality on the ground? We wanted to do that, obviously, because that's where the key activities are going to be performed. And unless this process is owned, quote unquote, by the cooperatives themselves, there is not that much of a chance of it being successful. So we have pre-tested with one specific partner cooperatives to whose members we are very, very gratefully sending our thanks. And we have a small video, which is a homemade video, so that we could get a little bit of a flavor of how they reacted to this exercise. Can we please have the video?
Just before the COVID-19 pandemic, which we were not prepared for, it came at the right time that we were able to utilize the information we had from the session we had to bounce back post-pandemic. This requires a collaborative approach amongst the cooperative members, the cooperative management, and all the stakeholders, so that we may provide solutions to emerging issues.
I've learned about how to overcome emerging issues. We have come through a lot of challenges. One is that we normally have droughts that has affected our farmers, and I've learned we can help our farmers to sustain so that this society can run smoothly.
We acknowledge the participation of OCDC in trying to impact life. We look for the like-minded to provide capacity building so that any other time we don't cry for help without sustaining. We look forward to having other engagements that we can share our experiences so that it can help others in other countries, and we take these cooperatives to greater heights.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So next slide, yes. We received feedback at various points of application of the diagnostic tool. And some of the noted comments were also included here. I think the point to stress is that this is a joint effort, and any joint action in that regard makes the co-op stronger. This is what the members and the leaders themselves have been stressing, and that their action is not a one-time action that will resolve issues. It is really a continuous process of finding strength in your own existing mechanisms, because they are there, but they may not be used to the best and most effective manner. So what we are planning to do now, next slide, please. This is our conclusion of the program. We would like to do the broader testing of this diagnostic tool. We invite every organization or leader or member who might be interested in this action to let us know, so that we could perhaps include them in our broader testing. We will take under consideration all the different feedback that we've already received, and we will proceed with this work of improving and getting the help where it's most needed and where it's most effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Barbara Shoska-Jones is a OCDC Learning Manager. And thank you, Mr. Nicole Hang is OCDC Research Assistant. It's really amazing, and thank you for action-oriented resource that will help cooperatives better prepare for the future challenge. Our next presenter will share findings from the review of the climate finance landscape. Ms. Isabel Balles, OCDC consultant, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I am delighted to be here today and to briefly present the highlights from a research commissioned by OCDC and ICRG. The research enabled to take a look at the landscape of climate finance from the perspective of both the relevance to cooperatives and also the potential benefit for cooperatives. So first, just to mention, the idea of the research paper came out of discussions that took place during the 2022 International Cooperative Research Group annual learning event that took place in January. And climate finance really came out as one of the key topics that members wanted to learn more about. So the research paper is divided in two parts, a main paper and also a companion report. The main paper provides a landscape overview of climate finance at the global level, and the companion report presents some more detailed information on 19 countries as examples, but details on the 19 countries and what is happening in those markets. That companion paper also has a template that will hopefully enable to do a similar research in other markets, recognizing that those 19 countries that are highlighted by no means represent all of the countries that you are collectively interested in. The paper itself is intended to be a resource that will help to expand cooperative development and deepen the beneficial impact of cooperative development by helping to access this pool of climate finance that is available. We're not quite there on this slide, but we're getting there. So the paper is divided in there are first three main objectives to the paper. One is to present the big picture of climate finance. It's a pretty complex landscape. So to provide some framing, second objective is to raise awareness and understanding for cooperatives on the funding mechanisms that are available and how cooperatives can access and use those mechanisms effectively. And the third objective is to enable cooperatives and CDOs to expand their climate and environment related activities. The research consisted in a significant literature review and several key informant interviews with a range of public and private climate funders. And the main report that is soon to be published is broken into three parts, as I mentioned: the framing, the state of climate finance, and how to access climate finance. So we really aim to cover some practical recommendations on what steps cooperatives can take to better position themselves to access climate finance. In the framing section of the report, what we are looking at is how does the international community talk about climate finance? Where does it sit into the international development agenda? How is it tied to the sustainable development goals? How do countries typically integrate climate action objectives and strategy into their overall development goals? And this is all very relevant when we are looking at accessing climate finance and framing activities in a way that is going to be tied to the bigger picture of what's happening at the market level. In the second part on the state of climate finance, what we were looking at is first, who is funding climate finance? So we took an overview of the public funders and the private funders and took a look at what they are funding, how much funding is flowing to climate-related activities, what types of innovations we are seeing, and last but not least, also, what are examples of cooperatives that are already getting access to this funding, and what are the best mechanisms for them to do that. We can move to the next slide. So this is an overview of the landscape for the public finance sources. All major public finance actors have a focus on climate finance. They are committed to supporting the Agenda 2030 that is in reference to supporting the Sustainable Development Goals and also the implementation of the Paris Agreement. There are dozens and dozens of climate targeted funds, including those that are focused on clean technology and renewable energy, on urban environmental infrastructure, those that are targeted more at forest management. So some of them are more specifically targeted at issues than others. But there are really a large number of these funds. They're typically managed by multilateral organizations and development finance institutions, either multilateral, bilateral, or national institutions. Nations also manage their own portfolios of climate-related fund projects. So the public funding usually takes forms of grants, of concessional loans, or technical assistance. And it is also important to note that this public funding is increasingly leveraged through blended finance transactions to attract more private capital. So the notion of de-risking the private investments by linking it to source of public funding as well. In addition, at the global level, there are also a number of specific funds that have been set up specifically as the financing arm mechanism to support the nations to live up to their commitments under the Paris Agreement and the other United Nations commitments around climate. Some examples are the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund or Global Environment Facility, so you may have heard of these. Those are pretty significant funds. And those funds are usually harder to access directly through from cooperatives. They are mostly the funding channel through these funds is mostly through accredited organizations or organizations that represent the various nations that are being supported. Those focal points, as I said, are accredited organizations or ministries of environment or planning. And the process for becoming accredited it varies, but it usually involves getting first the endorsement from a national focal point and going through a pretty extensive due diligence process. So although becoming an accredited organization for these specific climate funds is not out of reach for cooperatives, it is probably more suitable to umbrella organizations or to much larger cooperatives, and is not the it's not the obvious or preferred route for cooperatives to have access to public funding. Rather than becoming an accredited entity, what is recommended is to really get a better understanding in the markets where you operate and where you're interested on who are these accredited entities so that you can develop partnerships with them and then be well positioned to be an implementing organization for the projects that they have access to funding for, or also to help them shape their ask for funding as accredited entities. It's also worth mentioning that the public funds, like for example, the Green Climate Funds, are increasingly interested in becoming more accessible directly to nonprofit organizations or to civil society organizations and grassroots organizations in general. And they are working to simplify their processes in order for these organizations to benefit directly from the funding available so that it is less complex than what it currently is with the various layers and the need to go through accredited organizations. This, we believe, is highly relevant for cooperatives and is a trend that is worth following in the future. Next slide, please. So this was to give you a brief overview of the private financing sources. So private entities that are active in climate finance include a wide range of entities, including commercial financial institutions, for example, banks, non-financial institutions, and even fintech companies. Also institutional investors, including insurance companies, asset management firms, impact investors, pension funds, etc. Private equity, venture capital, and infrastructure funds, and all the way to corporations and households themselves that can also play a significant role. Of all the various sources of private finance, the commercial financial institutions and the institutional investors are more directly relevant for cooperatives today. And in particular, there are some private actors that are specifically targeting vulnerable and unbanked or underbanked populations who are disproportionately affected by the change in climate and also face an urgent need to increase resilience. The main messages about the state of climate funding that are highlighted in the report are, one, that there is a large variety of funding instruments and innovations that are out there, and they address different funding needs and allow to think creatively about how to increase the funding available, such as the example of the blended finance that I mentioned before to de-risk investments for private funders. In addition to helping to fund solutions to adapt to climate change, such as irrigation techniques or adoption of climate resilience seeds, there are also a range of financial services that are aimed to help vulnerable people address uncertainty and build resilience. So that's very relevant to the topic also, or this session, and to deal with climate crisis. One example is involving mobile wallets to receive digital money transfers from friends and family after a climate-related disaster, such as floods, as the ones that we have seen in Mozambique. Another example for funding adaptation includes loans to switch to more resilient seeds. So there's a large number of innovations. Many of them are highlighted in the paper. I do not have time to go over them now, but it's fascinating to see how the space is evolving. One area where there is that is particularly vibrant for innovation is asset financing. So financing, for example, access to solar energy or access to water pumps. And there are a number of new financing mechanisms that we are seeing, such as pay-as-you-go or asset as service, buy now, pay later. Anyway, just a lot of innovation taking place that is also very highly relevant for a number of cooperatives, especially the ones that are active in the agriculture sector or energy sector. Another key point is that there is a lot of money that is flowing, but it is quite hard to track, especially on the side of where is the money going? Who are the recipients for climate fund? And some of the major sources of information are also highlighted in the report. So what do we know? What is the big picture? The climate finance landscape is dominated in volume by funding from private actors who make up over 50% of the total tracked funding. This is also likely to be significantly underreported because of the difficulty in keeping track of the private sources of funding. And unlike public sources of funding that are pretty well defined and closed or finite universe. Adaptation related activities. So this refers to recognizing that climate change is already happening and helping communities adapt to the effects of climate change. Those adaptation related activities are getting very little part of the funding. It's about 7% of total funding right now. And most of the funding is going towards mitigation strategies. So how to reduce the carbon footprint in the future, how to find ways to store the carbon that is already out there. So those tend to be much bigger investments in specific targeted industries, but less relevant usually for smaller organizations or for some of the organizations that we work with. And then maybe a last point on this, on what we are seeing, is that just a little over 13% of total funding is grants and concessional debt. So they represent also a fraction of total climate funding. So what does this all mean for cooperatives? Cooperatives are not directly targeted by funders usually, but they are highly relevant. So there's really an opportunity to raise the profile of cooperatives as very important actors in this space. Many cooperatives have already been doing for decades activities that are highly relevant to the climate agenda, even if it hasn't always been framed in the same language that current climate funders are used to. Next slide, please. So those are some examples that are highlighted, also not all of them, but some of them are highlighted in the report. Again, I don't think we have time to go over them now, but it is interesting to see some concrete examples of what and how cooperatives are accessing this funding. One example is in Burkina Faso, support to farmer cooperatives, and an example of the Climate Investment Fund approving a $4 million loan to invest in farmer cooperatives to revive the sustainable cashew market. So that's an example that you can read more about if you're interested. Next slide, please. So our recommendations, again, as I said, a big part of this research was also to highlight concrete recommendations on how cooperatives can better position themselves to access climate funding, and where can you go to have access to the information that you need also. So so when we consider looking for climate funding, it is very important to understand the country's climate priorities and objectives, as I mentioned before. There are a number of official documents that are used by countries to track their official commitments under the Paris Agreement and their progress towards implementation. Those documents are really highly informative and very important to be able to then position your work to have access to this funding. So that's one first recommendation, is to highlight what is happening at the national level and get familiar with the official commitments and how the agenda and priorities are framed. The second recommendation or important point is to understand the main players that are active in the country. So as I mentioned before, especially for the public funders, there are organizations that are specifically positioned to be able to release the funds or not. And so understanding who are the public funders that are particularly active in the markets that you are interested in, and then who are the focal points, who are the accredited organizations, and developing partnerships or relationships with them to identify synergies with the work that you're doing. Last point here is preparing the ask. So to attract climate finance for a specific project, companies will need to clearly articulate how the project will positively contribute to improving climate mitigation or adaptation. So funders, whether public or private, will want to know, what is the funding for? Are you looking to access funds for a specific project, or are you looking to facilitate access for members? What is the project for? What do the members need funding for? So just starting to think of that. Second, the relevance to the climate agenda. And this is where the first point of understanding the market and the specific priorities is kicks in, is important, and will help to position kind of the ask in a context of what's happening in the climate agenda at the national level. And last but not least, measuring impact. What is your theory of change? What are your goals and levers to achieve those goals? What M&E will be used to track action and progress? What are the key performance indicators that will be monitored to verify climate change? So those are just some pointers of how to prepare yourself then to access climate fund, or to enter into the conversation with the organizations that are relevant to and can facilitate access to this funding. Next slide, please. Resources. There are a lot of resources that are available in the documents, both in the main document and in the companion document. They offer, as I say, resources by country to highlight concretely some of the major sources of information out there, and to help you navigate through this maze that is quite complex. So here you have, and you will see in the companion report for each of the countries that are highlighted, a number of websites or companies that are tracking, that are aiming to track what's happening. So the each country profile will contain data sources that are relevant for the particular country, context information, what in the country is relevant to know in terms of and its relevance to the climate agenda. For example, is the country located in a region where there are particular vulnerabilities to climate change, where there are a lot of coastal areas, or where there are a lot of forests. So having this context information is also important. What is the climate policy, and what is the climate finance landscape for the particular country? So I encourage you to, as you are digging further in your specific areas of interest, sectors of interest, or specific markets, I encourage you to go check those resources. They really provide a lot of information and a good entry point to navigate this space. One resource in particular that I would highlight is from the NDC partnership. It is also highlighted in the report itself, but it provides kind of a very easy way to screen for funds based on the type of projects that you are interested in funding for. You can also search by specific sectors or specific countries or specific types of organizations that are you're looking for funding for, and it will allow to have a summary list of the relevant funds that can be approached for depending on your selection criteria. So that's a very interactive site and a good place to also go and try to find, just play with it and find more information. So with that, I will stop. And again, delighted to have worked with OCDC on this. I think there is a lot of promise for cooperatives, and definitely, as I mentioned also before, increasing interest from the funders to be able to make better links with organizations that are working directly on the ground, that are working with the beneficiaries. So I look forward to the future of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Isabel Bellis, for the rich presentation, providing insights on the climate financing sources, both public and private. This is helpful for our cooperative societies. I would like to request the audiences to keep just texting their questions. They will be answered in writings for the sake of time, and the report will be shared. Up next, we will hear diverse voices in the Resilience Roundtable from CR2 Research Project in East Africa. On behalf of the global communities, we are joined today by Ms. Ashu Horst, Senior Technical Specialist of Cooperatives and Inclusive Businesses. Welcome, Ms. Ashuri. On behalf of Kenya Union of Savings and Credit Cooperatives Limited, we are joined by Mr. Elijah Aru, Manager of Research and Consultancy. Welcome, Mr. Aru. On behalf of International Cooperatives Alliance, IC Africa, we are joined by Dr. Loz Karimi, Program Manager. Welcome, Dr. Karimi. And on behalf of the Cooperative University of Kenya, we are joined by Dr. Charles Wambu, Senior Lecturer and Dean of the School of Cooperatives and Community Development. Welcome, Dr. Wambu.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Resilience panel. We will hear from each CR2 partner on one or two questions. What's the most undervalued lever to increasing cooperative resilience? Or which ingredient would you choose to build a more resilient ecosystem for cooperative success? Starting by Dr. Wambu, starting with you, we would like to hear from you on the most undervalued lever. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gasilica. In Kenya, the most undervalued lever for increasing cooperative resilience is one, gender parity in terms of governance of the cooperative societies. And number two, we do have the issue of the open bond, whereby SACCOs derive their membership from one sector of the economy, which affects them during pandemics like the one that we had of COVID-19. And this has affected their remittances and also the share capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I would like to also hand the same question to Dr. Karimi. Can you go on and tell us what's the most undervalued lever to increase the cooperative resilience?
Thank you, Caesar. I think I will answer that from the perspective of our research that we carried out on adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices to contribute to the resilience of small-scale coffee farmers in East Africa. We looked at the cooperatives from 5 East African countries, that's Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. And part of the objective was to identify what climate-smart agricultural practices contribute to the resilience of small-scale coffee farmers And specifically, we're also looking at trying to identify how climate change actually impacts production of coffee by coffee cooperatives, what climate smart agricultural practices were available, and to identify the incentives for the adoption of climate smart agricultural practices by coffee cooperatives, and then what barriers. Now, looking at our specific objectives, I would say that one undervalued lever is the incentives to increase, or to, what are the incentives for the adoption? Why is that? Because you realize when we, and I think Leah mentioned this, when you look at the national level, the climate practices, policies, and strategies are in place. However, from our research and findings, the cooperative leaders and members were not aware of this. So it's important that besides designing policies and strategies, it's also important to ensure that the implementation of the same is done. And citing one of the incentives that the respondents cited was increasing income. So they'll be motivated to adopt climate smart agricultural practices if these are going to increase their incomes and, of course, improve their livelihoods. So as we design and implement climate smart agricultural practices, it's important to have this in mind. We are not only going to increase the productivity of the agricultural products, we are not only going to reduce emissions, but we should also look at the increased resilience by the coffee or by smallholder farmers in general. And how do we increase their resilience? We increase their resilience by ensuring that their livelihoods are taken care of, that they have improved resilience from that perspective. So market-based strategies and policies are key into ensuring that the farmers are motivated to adopt these climate smart agricultural practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalimi. So let us hear the perspective of Mr. Alu. What can you tell us about that?
Thank you. Our perspective is that one of the key ingredients in building resilience in circles is actually centered around around governance, and we are talking here about good corporate governance. We did our research amongst border circles operating in Kenya. These are youths who are in the business of transport, using motorcycles as a means of transporting people. And we learned that most of them actually lack basic training on driving laws and regulations. They have very poor road etiquette, and they also lack financial management. And they have tried to form associations and circles, but these have not been on the whole very successful. And this is basically because of governance aspects around these associations and also around the circles. The absence of transparency and trust, especially in the officials, in how the affairs of the associations or circles are handled, is a significant hindrance to members' confidence, and by extension, their willingness to commit significant savings in the circles. So that trust element has to come from the members themselves, seeing that the affairs of the associations of the circles are run in a transparent manner and with integrity. So if this is enhanced, there is a very big chance that these circles and associations will begin to perform very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aru, for sharing the experience of Kenya Boda Boda that are just doing hard to improve their standard of living. Let me welcome Ms. Horst to tell us which ingredient would you choose to build a more resilient ecosystem for cooperative success.
Thank you. Our research at Global Communities was building on a social systems network analysis of the cooperative network in Kenya. And that analysis, that SSNA, included over 600 actors, which included cooperatives, service providers, apex organizations, all the different types of players within the cooperative network. And in our research engagement, we were going back to that network and asking them a little bit more about the ways in which they engage with other cooperative actors in the market, and also looking a bit deeper into some of the gaps that were persisting. So we found that the most resilient cooperatives, those that were really playing as a center actor where other cooperatives, other players were coming to them, we found that those cooperatives and actors had very strong networks, meaning they had lots of connections, they had access to different service providers, including finance, which we unsurprisingly heard as one of the greatest gaps in the market. And we found that many cooperatives verbalized that what they really, really needed was a connection or an access to cooperative specific services. So whether that be finance, business, training, or other kinds of inputs, what they really needed was for that fellow actor to understand cooperatives and be a part of the system. Because when they were receiving finance support, for example, from a non-cooperative aware entity, they weren't able to receive the types of services that they really needed. And finally, just speaking to resilience overall, coming out of or still experiencing in a lot of places the COVID-19 pandemic, we found from these cooperative actors that many of them had a very strong appetite for having this network online. And that was a big question that we asked about, whether people really felt like they could develop this type of community and network using online tools. And while there's still a lot of challenges in that area and we need some creative brainstorming to make it successful, most of the cooperatives in our study felt like they had grown a lot during the pandemic in terms of their ability to use technology and online networks, and they had appetite for building this network digitally. So for me, those are kind of my overarching reflections on resilience, is just continuing to create that strong network amongst cooperatives, creating access to cooperative specific service providers, and utilizing technology to strengthen the network. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, panelists, to this value you added to our collective learning. And we're going to shift to next part of our forum. Our next speaker is Ms. Emery Varga, USAID Engagement, Evidence, and Running Team Lead and Cooperative Business Specialist. She will offer reflections on the program today. Ms. Varga, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chesa, for the warm introduction. And thank you to OCDC's research group for hosting such an important event. As the agency's specialist on cooperative businesses, I often describe cooperatives as entities created to meet the evolving needs of their members. And colleagues are often surprised by this term evolving, as so much, how can an individual's needs change? And more importantly, how can a cooperative quickly adapt to meet those needs? We see that with external shocks and climate change, our immediate needs can and do change. I wanted to share some observations from today's discussion. In the study that reviewed the various value chains, specifically examining the business member ratio, we learned that membership actually increased during COVID. In times of stress, we do see that individuals often gravitate towards trusted institutions. Additionally, we learned that cooperatives diversified into other products during COVID, which actually reduced waste, but this was due to COVID restrictions, which is just a wonderful example of the versatility and responsiveness to members. In the collaborative research, we learned that cooperatives need to take short-term, medium, and long-term proactive actions to increase their resilience. Again, we see the importance of responding to the immediate needs of members while also contributing to a long-term business strategy. This reminds me of the importance of visionary leadership and effective change management in cooperatives. We also need to invite marginalized members, women and youth to the table to bring new, innovative ideas to mitigate and respond to external shocks. Solutions are not always discovered externally, but can be identified from within the cooperative. And I think that's really important to consider. In the discussion on the internal and external factors for cooperative resiliency, we learned that there are many factors for cooperative leadership to consider. And it's a reminder that cooperatives and credit unions, even those that are quite mature, they can be quite vulnerable without that baseline level of preparedness, which is why OCDC's resilience tool, the resilience framework, is essential for the longevity of cooperatives and credit unions. When I think about our prior investments in cooperative development, often we tried to solve one issue, one segment of the value chain, or one aspect of an organization. However, we need to invest in resilience holistically to preemptively mitigate and respond to external shocks. In the Green Climate Finance Report, we learned that there's a need to de-risk investments through blended finance. While not specifically targeted, second and tertiary level cooperatives can be uniquely positioned to access these funding mechanisms. And I found it interesting, the asset financing piece. And when we are able to locally mobilize member equity and perhaps also better document member level collateral, this makes cooperatives a unique partner in this space. And cooperative development organizations can assist local cooperatives and credit unions to identify the key partners to better access this finance. I also want to say that from the resilience roundtable, we learned the importance of incentives for the adoption of new climate smart approaches. While increased income is a powerful incentive, we know this, cooperatives need to clearly communicate to their members that such incentives for critical behavior change are available. And this reminds me of the resilience framework and the need to make holistic approaches to risk mitigation and response. Finally, I just want to thank OCDC's research group for organizing today's discussion. I want to thank everyone for their participation today. And I know we're all thinking about and working towards more resilient and responsive communities, and cooperatives are a critical factor of that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Varga, and our gratitude to USAID and for its perpetual support for the development community of cooperatives around the globe. Our next speaker, Dr. Sifa Chioge, ICRG Africa Regional Director, will share regional insights Dr. Chioke, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Truly appreciate this opportunity to share with you some of our insights. And the same goes to the organizers and especially the OCDC, which has been our great partner. First and foremost, I would like to say that when it comes to issues pertaining to how cooperatives in Africa have coped with the economic and the health crisis of COVID-19, I will not try to repeat what everybody has said because we have had some great researches coming from the different scholars talking about sub-Saharan Africa, but also the same could be extended to other parts of Africa. Indeed, the COVID-19 and also the current economic crisis emanating from definitely from the health crisis, but as well as the ongoing war in Ukraine has impacted negatively the continent. It has put more pressure on the health system, which was already weak. And also some of the economic gain have been reversed. And it might take us, they estimate that it will take us 5 to 10 years to go back to the level of pre-COVID-19 situation in Africa. So basically, we can see that anything which is not moving forward is going backward. But unfortunately for us, beside going backward, at least we also reversed because of the weak situation, that the precarious situation that Africa does find itself vis-a-vis the macroeconomic, but also social and also health situations that we do face. However, as a cooperative movement, we have seen that we have looked at it as also an opportunity since our business model happened to thrive during crisis. You remember that indeed even the above story about cooperatives was about all about at least the modern cooperative system about a period of crisis. And we try to fare quite well during that period. That is the cooperative across the globe, and the cooperative in Africa as well did not disappoint in that manner. First, I would like to say that to note that we're equally affected as cooperatives. First, because of the restricted mobility, we could not do business as usual. So with that, quite a number of our services and the products could not move from point A to B. So there were quite a lot of loss of opportunities in terms of income, but also the job opportunities among others. However, given our business model, because we are community-based, and because of the solidarity aspect which is embedded in our business model, we're quite able to serve little be it our members who are closer by, because that was an advantage given that we are community-based organizations, so we're able at least to reach those who are not far away in whichever way. Maybe customers who are far away, they were the ones who suffered most, but at least in terms of membership, they were still able to access one or two things little be it. Second to that, the cooperative, because there were a lot of business opportunities, then our finances were impacted. So basically that also did put pressure on our activities. But having said that, our financial cooperatives were able to chip in and help in whichever way they could. We had our circles and also the cooperative banks, be it in Tanzania and Kenya, who were able to assist the government's efforts in the relief kits or relief efforts. And our members then did contribute toward the kit and be able to contribute to at least the emergency situation, as it were. Further than that, we could also say that some of our cooperatives, the health cooperatives also took the opportunity, especially the health partners, that is the Uganda one, were able to expand quite well in the community during the COVID era. This also has helped us to propagate the message, or rather to sell the message of health cooperatives, because they have now seen the importance of community-based solutions in terms of healthcare, and health cooperatives then becomes the best model as far as that is concerned. I know time is not on our side. I would like maybe to just conclude by saying that as much as we are having the impacts of, that is the health, but and also economic impacts emanating from the COVID-19, but also this is the right opportunity for cooperatives in Africa to reinvent themselves in all the sectors. And if we have to speed up the recovery, then the cooperative movement becomes paramount. And that is how, and the message we have been also fronting as we go to the African Union. Like I said earlier, we are having projects, the strategy for social and solidarity economy, which is on the table in African Union. We have contributed with the same message, same as the cooperative model law at the parliament, the African Union parliaments. So basically, as we go again in October to our ministerial conference in Egypt, the same message will be reiterated, that we need to embrace and empower and revigorate our cooperatives if we want to speed up the process of recovery in Africa and by extension the world. Thank you.
Thank you much, Dr. Sifa, for the insightful sharing on how cooperatives in Africa have coped with the economic and health crisis of COVID-19, and the cooperative business being a good model that was helping them to be a good foundation to stand still during the hard times of crisis. We are nearing to the end of our time today, and I'm honored to welcome the OCDC Executive Director, Mr. Paul Harrison, to deliver the closing remarks. Mr. Harrison, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chesa, for the nice introduction, and thank you for an excellent job of moderating today's webinar. I want to also thank all of our panelists for their presentations today. You did an excellent job. And I'd also like to thank the International Cooperative Research Group colleagues for your excellent work with developing this research and presenting it today in a very effective manner. This webinar is an example of our vision for the International Cooperative Research Group that was started a number of years ago, that we would conduct vigorous research, apply it in the field, develop tools, and learn lessons that can be shared with others about effective cooperative development. And I think we really did a great job with this particular resilience research project in doing that and achieving our goal. We have a lot of materials that are available, other research reports on the OCDC website at ocdc.coop, and I would encourage you to take advantage of those resources and also share them with other colleagues and encourage them to participate in International Cooperative Research Group future webinars and learning events. I think my biggest takeaway today from this resiliency work is that about the high level of trust that cooperative members have in their businesses that they own, their cooperatives. And this trust is developed over a long period of time of honesty and openness, transparency, and delivering real value back to the members. And the members knowing that the cooperative is going to be there in times of crisis for them. And the bottom line is not the most important aspect when you're in time of crisis. So I think this research work on resiliency has proven what we all know in our heart, that cooperatives are there for their members, but now we have data, we have research, we have evidence, and we have tools to work on this particular aspect of cooperatives. So once again, I just want to thank all of you for participating in the program today and encourage you to take advantage of all the research reports on the OCDC website. Once again, thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you much, Mr. Harrison, the Executive Director of the OCDC, for the closing remarks. Before we close our forum, we would like to hear your feedback. Please click on the link shared to your screen on the chat section and give us your view on this event. On behalf of the OCDC ICRG, I would like to thank everyone who participated in this forum as we strengthen our cooperative societies to increase their resilience to crisis and ensure our common prosperity. For the sake of time, not everyone has had the opportunity to share his or her view or ask questions. However, you can visit our OCDC website, www.ocdc.coop, or send on the info@researchgroup.ocdc.coop. Thank you so much. We're looking forward for further engagement, and we send you our warmest cooperative greetings. Have a nice day.